Hello and welcome to an analysis of London by William Blake. This video is part of our Power and Conflict series, and we'll be looking at the various themes of the poem, as well as where to find the best quotes for your essays. So I'm going to be dividing everything we talk about into the following 4 themes: suffering, society, religion, and sound. Each quote that we discuss will belong to one of these categories, and I'm going to use the following colours so we can easily distinguish them. Alright, so before we begin, I'm going to give you a brief summary of the poem. I won't be reading the whole thing today, so just make sure you're already familiar with the text before we begin. So the poem is told through the eyes of an anonymous speaker who walks the streets of London in the late 1790s and recites what he sees. From infants to chimney sweepers, the speaker meets a variety of people and reflects upon their situations. This really is all that there is to it, as London is a pretty short poem. Now, when I think of this poem, the first thing that comes to mind is suffering. Particularly, Blake is keen to show the universality of suffering and how it affects broad groups of people, not just individuals. There are tons of examples of suffering in this poem, and we really want to look at words such as woe and weakness in the first stanza to get a sense of what this poem is going to be about. Instead of just listing images of suffering, I want to focus on the idea of universal suffering and how Blake reinforces it. Let's look at line 3 and the image of every face. This really is key to our understanding of the poem, and it represents the idea of universality perfectly. The word every is all-encompassing, and it doesn't leave any room for exceptions. Everyone we see in this poem is suffering, and the fact that it is every face is even more chilling. There is a sense that humanity as a whole is suffering, as we are all united by our shared physical biology, our shared faces. Blake turns this into a structural device by repeating the word every again and again. This is particularly impactful in the second stanza, where the word visually dominates the first part of every line and gives us an impactful feeling of universality. Also think about the people who Blake is referring to, as he tells us of every man and every infant. His focus on age is interesting here, and we can see how suffering is also universal between ages. This isn't a problem which only affects one group, it affects everyone, even children. Repetition isn't the only structural device that Blake uses here, as we should also look at rhyme and rhythm. Notice how consistent our rhyme scheme is with the recurring A-B pattern. This is so significant because it shows how consistent the suffering has become in this city, so much so that it is predictable and repetitive. The same thing can be said of the rhythm, as Blake uses iambic tetrameter throughout. Just by reading the first stanza, we can feel how regular the rhythm feels. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. All of this just shows how common this suffering has become. It is regular and predictable in a shocking way. Next, I want to have a look at society, as well as some of the contextual issues which Blake was dealing with. At the very heart of this theme is a struggle between different groups within society and a discussion of who holds the power. We can see how Blake already divides his poem by occupational groups, with people such as the soldier and the chimney sweepers taking centre stage. Let's start by looking at the final image of this poem, the marriage hearse. On the one hand, we have marriage, which at the time was a symbol of a stable society, the union of two people who become one in the eyes of God. Therefore, it seems strange that Blake couples this with the hearse, which is a symbol of death. Therefore, new life and death are pushed together in an almost oxymoronic way, creating an image of conflict and tension. For me, this is the most important image in the poem, as it shows the general health of the society. Blake's speaker looks around the city and sees a social plague in the final line, one which has started to corrupt the once stable institution of marriage. Now, this isn't just because of the harlots on line 14, it's because society as a whole is changing. Blake was writing at a time of great social change, which was brought about by the Industrial Revolution. As more and more factories were built in urban areas, the rich became richer and the poor became poorer. More money meant more inequality for many people, and this is exactly what Blake is exploring in his poem. Let's have a look at the image of mind-forged manacles on line 8. This is one of the most famous images in all of English literature, and it encompasses the inequalities of the Industrial Revolution perfectly. Manacles are like handcuffs, and the fact that they are forged in the mind not only gives us this industrial feel, but it also shows how the forces which bind society are intangible. Things such as class and wealth are not natural occurrences, they are man-made inequalities that have been created in the factories of the upper class. Perhaps Blake's main reference to the upper classes is in the very first line of the poem, with the phrase chartered streets. Simply, this means that the streets of London have been divided up, but on a broader level, this is all about control. The result is that there are some people who have control and others who do not. This is particularly problematic on line 2, when we are told of the chartered Thames. Here, even the natural world has become something that can be dominated and controlled by those with power. Blake goes on to tell us that the Thames does flow, but it seems strange that something could flow so freely whilst also being under strict control. Perhaps we can interpret this as another image of conflict, as the natural world has become dragged into these human power struggles. However, we might also argue that nature will always flow, regardless of what mankind does to try and control it. In this case, nature would be ambivalent towards humanity, and you want to explore this point in relation to some of the other poems in this collection. Ultimately, it is this kind of tension that defines Blake's society, as the divides between rich and poor continue to increase. The other contextual point here is the French Revolution, which was still a very recent event at the time that Blake was writing. Visions of beheaded French monarchs were still very fresh in the poet's mind, and he alludes to these ideas on line 12. The image of blood running down the palace walls is a direct reference to the French Revolution, and the soldier becomes a metaphor for the forgotten lower classes who are expected to take their orders without question. This is only a brief moment in the poem, but it is nevertheless a reminder of what can happen when social divisions run too deep. Blake's reference to religion is also brief, but I thought that it would be a useful theme to consider when you're making comparisons with other poems in the exam. Let's look at line 10, as Blake describes how every blackening church appalls at the sight of this suffering. This is an interesting image, because yet again there is a kind of conflict. On the one hand, the church is blackening like the soot of the chimney sweeper, but on the other, it's going white and pale. We get this from the word appalls, which literally means to go white with shock. Therefore, it seems strange that the church could be both black and white at the same time. To make sense of this, let's have a look at one more point of context in Blake's life. Blake was a man of faith, but he had become disenchanted with organised religion, which is represented by the church in this poem. As a result, Blake's speaker looks out onto this world of suffering and sees a church which has no clear direction. It is neither black or white. It is neither useful or useless. But for Blake, organised religion cannot provide the solutions needed at this time of great suffering. Sound is one of the more difficult themes in this poem, and perhaps you'll have your own way of interpreting exactly what it means. We can't ignore the sheer amount of references to sound in this poem, and I'll highlight just a few here. For me, this is an incredibly noisy poem, and we are constantly being told about what the speaker hears, whether it's the soldier's sigh, the infant's cry, or just the sound of every voice. However, we need to make a distinction between what the speaker hears and what we hear. I want you to notice the fact that everything is told through the eyes of the speaker, and this creates a distance between us and the people we are reading about. We never hear their voices or hear their cries, and this actively separates them from us, as if we are too far away to truly help. For Blake, these are issues that cannot be solved by poetry, and we can argue it actually prevents us from action. Here, the form of the poem is secondary to the fact that this just is a poem, a medium which has its own flaws and setbacks. In order to solve these social issues, we need not turn to poetry, but to open our eyes to the suffering which is all around us. So, those are the main themes for London, and some of the key quotes and contexts that you can use in your essays. If you want to gain full access to all the videos in this series, then make sure to check out the Power and Conflict course at 88tuition.co.uk. Thanks for watching, see you next time.